In the glamorous world of wealth and high society, some people wear their success like a mask, hiding the darkness beneath. Marlon Harris, a powerful CEO in Florida, appeared to have it all: the perfect family, a thriving business, and respect in the community. But behind closed doors, he was hiding a secret so shocking that it would tear his family apart. This is the twisted story of a man who used his influence and manipulation to control the one person who trusted him most, his own nephew, leading to betrayal, violence, and a heart-wrenching pursuit of justice. Betrayal is a dangerous thing, especially when it comes from those closest to us. Marlon's life was built on a foundation of lies and control, and when that foundation cracked, the consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. This is a story about manipulation, survival, and the terrifying power of secrets, proving that some betrayals are so deep, they leave scars that never fade. Stick around for this spine-chilling tale of deceit and revenge, and make sure to subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more stories that dive deep into the darkest sides of human nature. Marlon Harris, at 42, was the embodiment of success, wealthy, powerful, and respected in the business world. As the CEO of a leading tech company in Florida, his life was a picture of perfection. He lived in a sprawling mansion with his 40-year-old wife, Jessica, a former model turned philanthropist, whose grace and beauty complemented Marlon's wealth. Together, they made the ultimate power couple, admired by all who knew them. But as flawless as their lives appeared, there was a dark undercurrent they desperately worked to keep hidden. The perfection began to unravel when tragedy struck. Marlon's sister, Lisa, succumbed to a long battle with cancer, leaving behind her 14-year-old son, Aaron. Although Marlon and Jessica had no children of their own, they decided to take Aaron in, offering him a better life. Marlon, ever the businessman, saw an opportunity to mentor Aaron, helping him achieve success and carry on the family legacy. Aaron, still grieving the loss of his mother, was hesitant at first. He'd been living in a small apartment with Lisa, never fully understanding the lavish lifestyle his uncle and aunt led. But as time went on, he started adjusting to his new life. Jessica welcomed him with open arms, and Marlon began to take him under his wing, showing him the ropes of the business world. He shared stories of how he built his empire from the ground up and promised to teach Aaron everything he knew, all while shaping him into the next successor of his fortune. As Aaron settled into his new life, Marlon's mentorship became more intense. The older man seemed obsessed with shaping Aaron's future, even as the young boy struggled to find his own identity. Marlon pushed Aaron harder than he had ever pushed anyone, trying to instill in him a relentless drive to succeed. Aaron began to feel the weight of his uncle's expectations, unsure if it was for his benefit or if Marlon simply saw him as an asset to be molded into someone who would serve his uncle's desires. But no matter how much he questioned Marlon's intentions, Aaron couldn't help but admire his uncle's accomplishments and the power he wielded. Meanwhile, Jessica noticed the growing bond between her husband and nephew. Though she was happy that Aaron was adjusting well, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right between them. Still, she kept her concerns to herself, trusting Marlon's judgment and believing his actions were rooted in genuine care for Aaron's future. The family appeared to be living in harmony, but beneath the surface, a storm was beginning to brew, one that no one could have anticipated. As the months passed, Marlon's mentorship began to take on a more sinister edge. At first, it seemed harmless: late-night discussions about his future, casual advice about relationships, and life lessons on how to navigate the world of wealth and power. But slowly, Marlon's attention toward Aaron grew increasingly intense, crossing boundaries that should never have been crossed. Marlon, always the confident and authoritative figure in Aaron's life, began to manipulate the young boy under the guise of guidance. He used his power as both an uncle and a figure of admiration to exploit Aaron's vulnerabilities. The moments of praise for Aaron's potential became more frequent, but they also carried a hidden price. It was during these times, when Aaron was vulnerable, that Marlon began to push the boundaries of their relationship. What initially began as mentoring soon turned into something far darker: an affair, secretive and illegal, one that neither of them could escape from. Marlon's power over Aaron was suffocating, and he manipulated the young boy's insecurities and admiration into submission. Aaron felt trapped. He didn't know how to escape Marlon's control. Each time he tried to distance himself or speak out, Marlon would threaten to throw him out of the house, into a world where he had no resources and no protection. Marlon's manipulation was subtle, but effective. He used his position of power to silence Aaron's voice, making him believe that no one would believe him, that no one would take his side. Aaron feared the world outside the mansion, knowing that Marlon could ruin him in an instant. He thought he was bound to this man, this uncle who had saved him after his mother's death, and now the person who was destroying him. As weeks turned into months, Aaron's health began to deteriorate. The once athletic teenager, full of promise and vitality, became thin, pale, and weak. His appetite disappeared, and his energy vanished. He would lie in his room, exhausted, and whenever he tried to push through it, the pain and sickness would overwhelm him. His body became unrecognizable. His skin lost its luster, his eyes grew sunken, and he started to feel a crushing weight on his chest, both physical and emotional. Jessica, who had once seen Aaron as a symbol of hope for the family, started to notice the drastic changes. She couldn't ignore how sickly he looked, how pale and drained he had become over the course of just a few months. At first, she chalked it up to stress, maybe even homesickness. But there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. She wondered if Aaron was keeping secrets, and that thought gnawed at her. But what hurt the most was that Aaron refused to talk to her. He had grown distant, withdrawn, and every attempt to reach out to him felt like pushing against a wall. She noticed how he would flinch whenever she asked him about his well-being, his face pale with fear. And that fear was always directed towards one person, Marlon. Aaron's growing sickness wasn't just the result of poor diet or stress, it was a sign of something far darker. Marlon's actions, which had begun as manipulation, were now taking a toll on Aaron's very existence. His body, mind, and spirit were crumbling under the weight of his uncle's abuse. But no matter how bad things got, Aaron couldn't find a way out. He was too scared, too broken, and too isolated to ask for help. But his silence couldn't last forever. The more Aaron's body deteriorated, the more Jessica began to suspect something was wrong. Something was hiding in the shadows of her seemingly perfect family. She just had to figure out what. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Aaron. Despite her warm and loving attempts to comfort him, the boy's health had continued to decline at an alarming rate. His pale complexion, the way his eyes would avoid her gaze, and his unnerving silence, it all painted a picture of someone who was in severe distress. As a motherly figure in his life, she couldn't ignore the growing pit in her stomach. She had to know the truth. One evening, as Aaron was seated at the kitchen table, his slumped shoulders and faint breaths nearly brought Jessica to tears. She approached him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Aaron, honey, I know you're struggling, but I need you to trust me. We're going to get you checked out. You're not alone in this." Aaron hesitated for a long moment, his lips trembling. But the weight of his sickness seemed to push him toward acceptance. Finally, he nodded faintly, unable to refuse her any longer. The next day, Jessica took Aaron to the doctor, praying that it was nothing serious, just an infection, perhaps, or a simple case of exhaustion. But deep down, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was more to his illness than just a physical ailment. The doctor's office was silent, the air thick with tension, as Jessica anxiously waited for the test results. The minutes stretched on endlessly, each second adding to her mounting anxiety. When the doctor finally returned, his expression was grave. "Mrs. Harris," the doctor began, his voice low, "I'm afraid the tests came back positive. Aaron has contracted HIV." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Her mind couldn't comprehend the words. HIV? Her thoughts raced. How could this be possible? Aaron had been living under their roof for months, well taken care of. There was no way he could have contracted this virus without a clear source. She felt a cold chill creeping up her spine. "Are you sure?" Jessica asked, her voice shaky. "How could this happen? We've made sure he's been safe, he's been monitored closely, this doesn't make sense." The doctor sighed and nodded, confirming the worst of her fears. The results were undeniable. But Jessica couldn't fathom how her nephew, her own flesh and blood, could have contracted HIV under their roof. There were no external influences in his life that she could think of that would explain this, and yet, the evidence was right before her. As Jessica sat in stunned silence, the weight of the situation fell on her. She had to know more. She needed answers. When they returned home, Jessica couldn't ignore the devastation within her anymore. The pieces didn't fit. She stared at Aaron, who sat on the couch, still pale and exhausted. It was time to confront him, to press him for the truth. With a trembling voice, she asked, "Aaron, please. I need to know what happened. How did you get HIV? You have to tell me." Aaron's eyes filled with tears, and his gaze dropped to the floor. He looked as if the weight of the world had finally broken him, and his silence spoke volumes. Jessica's heart raced as she realized this was much worse than she had anticipated. She gently pulled him closer, her voice soft but insistent. "Aaron, I need to know. Please. Was it someone at school? Did something happen when you went out?" But Aaron shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't anyone at school, Aunt Jessica. It wasn't outside." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. A cold shiver ran through her body as she slowly pieced the puzzle together. The pieces were dark, horrifying, and made her blood run cold. "Aaron, what are you saying?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Aaron's shoulders shook as he finally confessed the unthinkable. "It was Uncle Marlon. He's the one who did this to me." The words hung in the air like a nightmare come to life. Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind reeled. Her husband, the man she had trusted above all others, the man who had been so close to her, so kind to Aaron, was responsible for this monstrous betrayal. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, already dialing the number for a hospital that could confirm Aaron's HIV status. The confirmation came quickly, sealing the truth. The affair was real. The abuse was real. Marlon had been sexually abusing Aaron, and now, it was clear that he had passed on HIV to his nephew, all while Jessica had been none the wiser. With a heart heavy with grief and rage, Jessica knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to confront Marlon. She had to force him to look her in the eye and explain the horrors he had subjected Aaron to. When Marlon arrived home that evening, his usual confidence was overshadowed by the tension in the air. Jessica stood in front of him, her face pale and stern. She locked eyes with him, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "Marlon, how could you do this? How could you betray me like this? How could you betray Aaron? He trusted you, he's been living in this house with you, and this is what you did to him?" Marlon froze, his face going ashen as he realized what Jessica had learned. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was silence. The reality of his actions hung heavily in the room. "I never meant for it to happen, Jessica," he began, his voice low, almost apologetic. But there was no sincerity in his words, only guilt and shame. "Don't try to justify it," Jessica shouted, her fists clenching. "How long, Marlon? How long has this been going on? How could you hurt Aaron like this?" Marlon's head dropped, and he muttered under his breath. "It was a mistake. I was weak. I'm sorry, but I don't know how it got this far." "A mistake?" Jessica spat. "You've destroyed our family. You've destroyed my nephew. You." Before she could finish, Marlon cut her off. "I'm HIV positive, Jessica. I've been for months. And now you'll likely be infected too. That's the price I'm paying for my actions, and now you'll have to live with that too." His words were a knife to her heart. Everything was unraveling in front of her eyes. The reality of his betrayal was suffocating. Jessica, in her anger and despair, didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain: this man, her husband, would not walk away from this unscathed. With all the rage of a woman who had been betrayed and hurt, Jessica moved to the kitchen. Without a word, she grabbed a knife from the counter and turned back toward her husband. In one swift motion, she stabbed him. The blood spilled onto the floor, staining the hardwood beneath them as Marlon let out a horrified gasp. But Jessica didn't stop. She stabbed him again and again, the weight of his betrayal coursing through every swing of the knife. She wasn't thinking anymore, only acting on the fury and the anguish that had been building for so long. In the end, Marlon lay in a pool of his own blood, gasping for air as the life drained from him. Jessica stood over him, trembling, her hands covered in his blood. She didn't feel the relief she expected, only the hollow emptiness of a broken life. Jessica stood over Marlon's bloodied body, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath a shaky gasp of shock and anger. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just transpired, but her emotions overwhelmed any rational thought. The man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her life, lay before her, his blood staining the floor, his breaths shallow and strained. Her hands were slick with his blood, and the weight of her actions was only just beginning to sink in. She had done this. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, she had taken her husband's life, not out of cold malice, but out of a desperate need for justice, for retribution for the horrors he had inflicted upon her nephew. Jessica stumbled back, the knife slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. Her legs buckled beneath her as she collapsed onto the couch, her face streaked with tears. Her emotions were a violent mix of rage, betrayal, disbelief, and sorrow. Her stomach churned with guilt, but the pain of knowing what Marlon had done to Erin, how he had betrayed her family, ruined her nephew's life, drowned out everything else. The weight of his confession, the devastation in Erin's eyes, had shattered her, and she couldn't stop herself from reacting in the only way she knew how. She shook her head, her thoughts a blur as she stared at the lifeless form of the man she had called her husband for so many years. "I didn't want to do this," she whispered, her voice cracking as she spoke to no one but herself. "But you left me no choice, Marlon. You left me no choice." Her emotions seemed to consume her. The rage that had been building up inside her finally found an outlet. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the HIV or the lies. It was everything, the way Marlon had manipulated their lives, the way he had stolen from her nephew and destroyed their sense of trust. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, and the consequences of her actions now lay in front of her. But even as she stood there, breathless and trembling, she knew what had to come next. She had just committed a brutal act of violence. She had taken the law into her own hands, and she couldn't escape the truth of it. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she dialed the emergency number. The screen felt slippery, the cold metal of the phone pressing against her clammy skin. As soon as the dispatcher answered, she choked out the words, "I need help. My husband, he's hurt. I've killed him." The dispatcher's calm, steady voice contrasted sharply with the chaos of her emotions. "Ma'am, please remain calm. We're sending officers to your location. Can you tell me what happened?" Jessica closed her eyes tightly, the tears streaming down her face as she recounted the tragic events in fragmented sentences. He's my husband. He hurt my nephew. He's the reason Erin has HIV. I didn't know what else to do. He destroyed us. He destroyed my family. Her voice cracked as the words tumbled out in a rush. I'm so sorry. As she spoke, she could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached the house. The sound seemed to echo in her mind, a harbinger of the inevitable. Jessica felt numb, the reality of what she had just done sinking in. There was no turning back now. She had committed a crime, and the consequences would be severe. Minutes later, the front door burst open, and a team of police officers rushed in. They quickly assessed the scene, their eyes immediately locking onto Marlon's motionless body. One of the officers rushed to check for a pulse, his face grim as he shook his head. He's gone, the officer said, his voice low and steady. Ma'am, we're going to need you to step away from the body. Jessica obeyed mechanically, her body shaking uncontrollably as she stood up. The officers placed her in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her wrists. You have the right to remain silent, one of the officers recited, his voice professional, detached. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words barely registered in Jessica's mind as she was led outside, where the flashing lights of the police cars cast a haunting glow over the scene. The weight of the night's events settled on her like a heavy blanket. She had done something unforgivable, something that couldn't be undone. And as she was placed in the back of the police car, she knew that her life would never be the same again. The journey to the police station was a blur, Jessica's mind swirling with the aftermath of her actions. What had she done? Was it truly worth it? But in her heart, she knew the answer. She had been pushed to the edge. She had been forced to make a choice that had forever changed everything. But the cost of that choice was more than she could ever have imagined. At the station, Jessica was booked and processed, the reality of her crime settling in like a weight in her chest. Her life had come crashing down around her, and she could do nothing but wait. The road ahead was uncertain, and the consequences of her actions were impossible to predict. But in the silence of her cell, one thing was clear, she had lost everything. The trial was a whirlwind of emotions, with Jessica's defense highlighting the years of emotional and psychological abuse she had endured. The prosecution argued that no matter the circumstances, taking a life was unforgivable. Yet, the jury could not ignore the emotional turmoil that had pushed Jessica to her breaking point. In the end, they returned a verdict of manslaughter, offering her a surprisingly light sentence of 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. As she was led away in handcuffs, Jessica's heart remained heavy with regret. She had sought justice for Aaron, but the price had been steep. Prison became her new reality, and though her body was incarcerated, her mind remained trapped in the memory of that fateful night. Meanwhile, Aaron's journey was far from over. Taken into foster care, he began the long road to healing. The abuse he had suffered left permanent scars, physically and emotionally. His HIV diagnosis required constant medical attention, and the therapy sessions were an attempt to piece together the fragments of his shattered life. The betrayal by the man who had been like a father to him haunted him every day, but he tried to rebuild, determined not to let Marlon's sins define him forever. As time passed, Aaron found strength in his recovery, but the scars of Marlon's betrayal would remain with him for the rest of his life. This is a story of manipulation, betrayal, and the devastating effects of unchecked power. Marlon's actions tore apart his family, leading to a chain of events that none could have predicted. While justice was served in the eyes of the law, the emotional toll of this tragedy will haunt all involved for the rest of their lives. What would you do if you found out the person you loved most had destroyed your life? Could you forgive them, or would vengeance be the only answer? If this story shocked you, like and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more tales that delve into the darkest corners of betrayal and human behavior.